Growing up in hurricane and tornado territory, I became very familiar with storm preparation and response. When a storm was on its way, we had a routine, like most. First, the backyard. It was a big job. We'd had to pull in all the furniture, the toys and bikes and tools and toys and load them into the garage. The next task was to locate the flashlights and the lanterns and the batteries, and then the backup candles and the matches for when those failed us or whose batteries were dead to begin with. The bathtubs would be filled with water. My dad would get the transistor radio, and then Mama would start on the hall closet. Now, this particular hall closet was downstairs, beside this staircase and backed up into the living room of the house. It was not big at all, but it was away from any windows or doors, and it was located firmly in between these two foundational beams of this two-story structure. Now, for us to get in this closet, stuff had to get out of it first. So this was holiday decorations and unused or barely ever used appliances. And as I recall, lots and lots of blankets and quilts and afghans. They were pulled out and kind of put into piles around it. So when a tornado was winding its way through our town or a hurricane was barreling by, Mama would gather us all into this hall closet, my two sisters, me, and herself. Dad never was there, oddly enough. Now, we'd be pretty much pinned in, and then she'd pull off one of the mattresses of the bed and lean it up against those louvered doors, essentially sealing us off. The lights would usually go out, the power would shut off. It would be so hot, so oppressively humid, and pretty darn scary in that very small and very darkened space. All we could do there is just listen to the intensity of the winds and the pounding of the rain, the occasional crashes of debris into the house. Sometimes I'd wonder, with my heart beating loudly in my ears, if the house itself was just gonna be ripped off the foundation and kind of carried away, Wizard of Oz style. While the worst of any one of these storms might only last a half hour or so, that time could feel very, very slow. You could forget what had happened before, and you certainly couldn't imagine that it would ever stop. But there in that hall closet, Mama drew us close. It felt as secure as possible under those circumstances. I couldn't possibly feel alone while being literally smushed up to my family. And I couldn't forget that someone was watching out for me, with Mama right there, orchestrating our protection. She'd drawn us into the center of the center of the center of our house, and we stayed there until that storm had passed. I think we're in a storm right now. Do you feel that? We're in a moment when things that we counted on, the things that we kind of firmly planted our feet in, they're shifting uncomfortably. And many of us, honestly, are scared. We're worried, we're grieving, maybe we're numb or lost. I was at a meeting the other night with faith leaders and activists, and our facilitator asked us this: what is keeping you up at night? Now, there was a telling guttural moan, and then we went around the circle. Kids in cages, executive overreach and abuse of power, my queer kids, the state of our judiciary. I'm raising a 17-year-old black son in a country that doesn't want him to live. My debt, the ecological crisis we can't keep our attention on long enough to react to it. The fear that intersectional justice is just an ideal and can't possibly be achieved. I'm too anxious to turn my mind off to begin with. The voiced answers resonated with all of those present. Maybe you can find your worries in them too. And for each one given, there were so many more that could have been voiced. And I got the sense as we were sharing that people were kind of torn. They didn't know whether to give an example from the outside world, where we professionally confront and deal with systems and structures of our day, or draw for a more personal place and give voice to those tender and intimate worries, the ones that keep us up at night. Both are very real, very present, and very important. And when we hold kind of both sets of anxieties at the same time with no clear resolution in sight, sleepless nights, I think, can become all too frequent. It feels somehow harder to deal with our personal and practical concerns when we are living in such a time as this. What's happening to our world, to our nation and our communities is deeply unsettling. It should be. And in reaction to that, we're anxious and we become unmoored and we are scared. Our lives and our friends, our neighbors are affected directly. All of this is not theoretical. In a recent article in The New Yorker, writer and Harvard professor Jill Lepore draws a comparison between the 1930s widespread attack on global democracy to our current moment. Now, back then, democracies worldwide were being taken over by authoritarian governments. The most popular conversation topic of the time, she reports, was the death of democracy. Now, I find it incredibly helpful to look back at our history, to examine the fault lines of that past, and to learn. Now, in that time, the time that gave meaning to the words, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," democracy was clearly under attack. By the early 1930s, Hungary, Albania, Poland, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, Greece, Romania, Estonia, and Latvia all saw their democracies fail. Authoritarian rule multiplied in Portugal, Uruguay, and Spain. And fascists rose to power in Japan, Italy, and Germany. Now, within the US context, democracy was not safe either. Lepore cites W.E.B. Du Bois and his prediction that unless the United States met its obligations to the dignity and the equality of all of its citizens and ended its enthrallment to corporations, American democracy would fail. Du Bois wrote this: "If the U.S. government is going to use its power to force the world into color prejudice and race antagonism, if it is going to use it to manufacture millionaires, increase the rule of wealth, and break down democratic government everywhere, if it is going increasingly to stand for reaction, fascism, white supremacy, and imperialism, if it is going to promote war and not peace, then America will go the way of the Roman Empire." And here we are. And those claims that Du Bois made for his time in the 1930s could so easily be mistaken for words written for us right now. We are watching the U.S. political system live through what it could not have predicted and didn't account for. The ideological and geopolitical grounds we were standing on are shifting. But as Lepore explains, and we can remember, they have shifted before. Lepore argues that American democracy in specific survived only because of the deepest engagement with it. When folks criticized it with their lives, argued against it and with it, and fought for it to matter from both inside that system and outside. So what do we do now when the clutch of anxiety and the worry of our present moment seems to eclipse our ability to deal with it in the moment, much less imagine a future beyond it? Now, whatever storm is stirring in your life, lifting you off what you believed were your foundations, be they political or personal, practical or existential, let's reflect together. How do we weather these storms? Well, I think our passage from Matthew's Gospel this morning can help. Today we find Jesus giving this last illustration in the Sermon on the Mount. And for it, he draws from the family trade. He's the child of a carpenter. Jesus must have learned a thing or two from his father Joseph. He likely knew how to plan, build, and shore up structures. He must have known that it doesn't matter what comes afterwards or upwards. If the base of a project is unsteady, too shallow, or untrustworthy, a foundation must be constructed with the future in mind. It must consider the test of time and storm for it to hold integrity and for it to last. It's why building a house on sand is utterly absurd. As strong and beautiful and creative a dwelling it may be, it wasn't grounded, centered, and engaged with its core. So when the winds come, and they will come, it cannot remain. It was essentially rootless to begin with, and the builder whose home is founded and fastened onto rock, now that home will last. That house can last because it connects and engages with its base. It does so before the storm hits, and it will remain after it passes. I grew up being told by my parents when things went sideways or deeply down, and I felt unsure of my feet and certainly my faith, that the bottom holds. The bottom will hold, they used to say. So finally, after hearing this over years and years when I was a teenager, I said, where does that come from? And it turns out it was an allusion to a series of sermons by Reverend John Claypool in the early 1980s. Now, he's an Episcopal priest who started out as a Southern Baptist minister. He was a popular teacher and author and retreat leader at that time. It was on a retreat that he facilitated where my parents heard him. The phrase, "the bottom holds," well, it doesn't actually occur in any of his formal sermons. I know because I read them all. But it is the summation of Claypool's experience, the experience of the loss of his 8-year-old daughter to leukemia. Everything came undone. Loss of such magnitude and of such injustice is as fierce and unsettling as any storm I think we can contend. There can, in the midst of grieving such a tragedy, feel as if there is no ground at all beneath one's feet. So with that in mind, I went to his work and his wisdom. Reverend Claypool tries to put into words how God showed up in his pain, in his grief. And a warning, it was not in deliverance. It was not in miracles, but in the remembrance of where God had shown up before in his life. He found God's foundational love and presence in a time before the storm hit. He writes, I think it needs to be said that long before Laura Lou's sickness came upon us, I had struggled with the question of who God was and what God was like. I had already had some conviction, born in the light, that I was able to carry into the darkness and use as a frame of understanding. What would have happened in this moment, he writes, had I never struggled before with ultimate reality? I will never know. One does not sow and reap in the same day. And quite honestly, I must acknowledge that if this tragedy were my only conscious experience with God, I probably would not have come out where I did. He writes, I remembered the God who had made God's self known to me in the light. I believed God was present with us. I believed God was there as mystery. I believed God was there as inexhaustible energy, not weary and weak as we were. We cannot reap and sow on the same day. We cannot build our lives on shifting sand and then later expect rock. The bottom might hold, but we won't know if we don't have our feet firmly planted in it, if we haven't located it to begin with and done the slow and the lifelong work of building upon it. The good news for us, friends, is that we can learn to center ourselves in God's presence, God's love, and God's goodness. That can be our foundation. We look back at the sermon Jesus is giving, and he lays it all out for us. We're guided to put God in the center of the center of the center of our lives and build from there. Fashion a life motivated and inspired, held up and supported by God. We hear from Jesus a very practical construction plan in the Sermon on the Mount of how once we've located and affixed ourselves to God, how to build from there. And the list goes something like this. God is with those who are persecuted, poor, hungry, merciful, and grief-stricken. Do likewise. Let the light of God's love and justice shine through you. Help amplify it in the shadowy and uncertain world. Give glory to God in how you live. Love God with all you've got. Love your neighbor as yourself. Make peace with those you've sinned against. Love even those who don't love you, and love especially your enemies. Cultivate spiritual practices like praying and fasting and studying scripture. No, really, do them. Don't let money be your God. Don't let ambition be your God. In fact, you can't serve another if you are centering your whole life on the God of love. And finally, treat people like you want to be treated. These are instructions for how to build on the rock once you've found it, how to center our lives in God, and how to stay grounded in what will outlast the most uncertain moment and the fiercest storms that moment can whip up. The storms are here, and I do fear that more will come. But we know God is here too. We know because we cared to connect before the winds kicked up and the rains came down. We know because we can remember in the midst of the cyclone that God is drawing us to the center where we are known and loved. God hovers there with us, waiting out the fear and the anxiety and the tumult. Even in the storm, we can stand on holy ground. Amen.